Hi there. Let us know when we're all together, Katie. I just see the PAI team and our partners.
Not a problem. Good morning. Please give us just a few moments. We'll wait for more attendees to join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. For those that just joined, we're going to give it a few more minutes for additional attendees. So just be patient with us. Thank you so much for being here.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
All right, Christina, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name's Christina Wags. I am Vice President of Global Programs and Advocacy at PAI. We're thrilled to host a really exciting discussion today about work that advocacy leaders are doing around the world to hold governments accountable for meaningful investments in contraception and making sure that those investments actually translate into high quality services with equity at the front lines of service delivery. First, I want to say a little bit about PAI. We are a SRHR advocacy organization, a civil society organization. We're based in Washington, D.C. We were founded about 59 years ago with the goal of advocating with the U.S. government to make sure that the U.S. government's investments in SRHR supported universal access, equity, and we continue to work with the U.S. government to support universal access to SRHR. But in the past few years, we've been very fortunate to start working alongside 120 partners in 32 countries who are advancing universal access to sexual and reproductive health and rights in their own countries with their own governments, from the grassroots to the national. Some of our colleagues on the call as well are engaging with global policymaking bodies and global financing facilities to make sure that those prioritize SRHR and are including the voices of affected communities. I have the great pleasure to introduce my colleague Jen Sloboda, who is going to be telling you about this very exciting project that we've been doing on family planning budget accountability, and also our partners. If you could change to the next slide, please, Katie. So I want to introduce our partners, some of whom I just had the pleasure of being with in person at the International Conference for Family Planning. I first want to introduce our colleague, Wezi Mojo. Wezi, I don't know if you're able to get on screen. Wezi is the head of finance and administration at the Malawi Network of Aid Service Organizations, MANASO. We're going to hear about some very exciting work that MANASO is leading and convening among other civil society organizations to advance advocacy for family planning in Malawi. We're also joined by Charity. I don't know if Charity's on camera as well. Maybe you can give us a wave, Charity. Charity is, oops, I've lost the, okay. Charity is a health economist from Samasha Medical Association in Uganda. Samasha is an organization that is leading advocacy for sexual and reproductive health and rights in Uganda and developed something called the Common Framework, which is a systematic methodology for shaping budgets to ensure that they prioritize family planning. And she's going to be talking about the Common Framework and some work that Samasha has been leading. We also have with us Jérôme Chatigre, who's the executive director of a group called GRAFED in Benin. Nice to meet you. It's the first time that we're meeting Jérôme. And we're also joined by Julian. Oh, nice to meet you. We're also joined by Julian Tiguen, who's the president for the Initiative pour la Justice Sociale, la Transparence et la Bonne Gouvernance in Côte d'Ivoire, social justice. All of our colleagues are going to talk about work that they're leading to use the common framework, and also something called family planning scorecards to really push for meaningful budgets for family planning and push for budget accountability. And we're going to end with some closing remarks and next steps from our colleague Amos Mwale. Amos is the executive director of the Center for Reproductive Health and Education, and alongside Samasha had a leading role in refining the common framework methodology we're going to be hearing more about. So I'm going to hand it right over to my colleague Jen, who's going to tell us a little bit about the approach and methodologies that all of these partners are using, and then we're going to talk to our partners to hear about what they're doing. Over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Christina. I'm going to briefly introduce and provide some background on the project from which the FP budget scorecards came, and some of the high-level findings from this current set of 7 country scorecards. Sarah, could you go to the next slide? So this project is called the Government Accountability for Family Planning Budgets Project. It is a Hewlett Foundation funded project, which was launched in 2017, which was the beginning of the first phase. We completed the second phase in early 2021, and we are now in phase 3 of the project. It supports 10 civil society organizations in 7 African countries to hold their governments accountable for increasing domestic family planning investments and improving the transparency of family planning budget data. We have, of the 10 partners, there are 6 partners in Francophone West Africa and 4 partners in East and Southern Africa. The partners track the family planning budgets in their countries to generate evidence for real-time advocacy, and they produce the annual FP budget scorecard from this data. It's an advocacy tool that they use with policymakers. The methodology that they use for tracking budget data is called the Common Framework for Measuring Government Spending on Family Planning, which is an accountability methodology developed through this project by PAI and a group of civil society partners, including Samasha and the Center for Reproductive Health and Education, both of whom are represented in this webinar. This is the 3rd set of annual scorecards that we've produced. Next slide, please. So the Common Framework for Measuring Government Spending on Family Planning is a methodology that measures the performances of governments investing in FP supplies and services. It's a set of indicators that CSO advocates and others can use to track government spending on family planning services and supplies in a comparable way across countries. There are 10 indicators that are organized under 4 types of information that are produced during the planning and budgeting cycle: funding need, allocation, disbursement, and expenditure. There is also a transparency dimension to this methodology because it is necessary to measure access to family planning budget data for tracking and accountability purposes. The 2 tools associated with this framework are an online real-time FP budget tracking dashboard or tool, as well as the family planning budget scorecards, which is the advocacy tool. Next slide, please. So some high-level findings from the scorecards are the 5 presented here. The first is that countries are much more likely to fund contraceptive commodities than the FP programs that are needed to deliver both commodities and services. And I'll just give a couple of quick examples. Of the 7 countries for which data were tracked, 6 countries do not invest or invest less than 5% of the funding needed for family planning programs or services. Malawi and Tanzania have 0 domestic allocations and are fully dependent on donors to fund FP programs. Even in countries where governments allocate resources to purchase contraceptive commodities, the allocations fall far short of the funding need. However, we are seeing positive trends in governments investing more resources in contraceptive commodities. 3 out of the 7 countries increased their allocations, 2 maintained their allocations, and only 1 decreased its allocation. The second high-level finding is that over time, governments are doing a better job at fully spending the domestic resources that they allocate for contraceptive commodities. This is an important issue because in the past, we've seen significant underspending of allocations for commodities, which is problematic because that means that they're not being delivered to the people who need them. So for example, 3 out of the 7 countries spent 100% of their allocations for contraceptives, and 1 spent 69% of the allocation. So this is an improvement from previous years. Finding 3 is that despite this improvement, it is still very difficult to track how well governments are spending either their domestic or donor resources for FP services. In many country budgets, the FP services allocations are spread both within and across departments in the Ministry of Health. So it is difficult to impossible to identify how much the government is allocating and spending on FP services. This demonstrates a lack of budget transparency. For example, in Uganda, there is no FP services expenditure data because there's no single budget line or system that tracks it. And even in cases where governments allocate domestic resources for family planning services, if those funds are not spent fully, the allocation doesn't translate into services being delivered. And this undermines the impact of the government's investment. For example, in Benin, the FP programs allocation was 41% of the funding need in FY 2020, which is significant. It was the highest among all 7 countries, but only 26% of the allocation was spent. So that definitely impacts the provision of FP services on the ground. Finding number 4 is that FP allocation and expenditure data from the 7 countries for the 4 fiscal years tracked show no consistent increase in FP investment over time. And by this, we mean that we are not seeing year-to-year improvements in resource allocation and spending for contraceptive commodities and FP services. There are inconsistent ups and downs each year about how much is allocated and spent on commodities and services. This makes it challenging to plan and contributes to mistrust of the system by service users because the services and commodities availability is unpredictable and unreliable. The last finding is that there have been some improvements in transparency of family planning budget data over time. And across the 7 countries, overall family planning budget transparency has improved between the last 2 fiscal years tracked. In the current set of family planning budget scorecards, 49% of the total number of common framework indicators had data, compared to only 39% in the previous set. So that's a 10% percentage point increase. 4 of the 7 countries had data available for more indicators than in the previous set of scorecards, and 2 countries had no change, with only 1 having fewer indicators available. Data for fewer indicators available. And that summarizes the high-level findings. I'm happy to talk more about that when we have the Q&A if if people would like more information. And I'll hand back over to Christina.
Great, thank you, Jen. So we've heard a little bit about trends across countries and also some of the data that this tool has been able to surface. And I wonder if maybe we could go to Charity. Charity, Samasha Medical Association is the organization that actually innovated the Common Framework, which is this systematic methodology for tracking budgetary investments in family planning, including a tool to track investments in real time, and then also this scorecard to kind of track progress and track trends. I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about your development and use of this tool in Uganda, and specifically, what are some of the findings from the scorecard in this last year when you used it in Uganda? Over to you, Charity.
Thank you, Christina. And hello, everyone. Yes, for Samasha, so the common framework, as had mentioned earlier, has been very tracking domestic players, and the data that comes from the framework feeds into the budget scorecard. The budget scorecards have been a very useful resource for us to present evidence to policymakers, like the members of parliament, because we know that they're in charge of appropriation of budgets. It's also been very helpful to present this data to the Ministry of Health to show them where the gaps are, because the various indicators on the budget scorecards show where the gaps are in allocations, and also where we cannot access data. And it tackles issues such as transparency or the lack thereof, and also issues of timeliness when it comes to disbursements of budgets. Then the other avenue that the budget scorecards has been very useful for is for budget advocates. We work hand in hand with other budget advocates, about a group of about 40 in a group called Family Planning Budget Advocacy Group. And over the years, we have supported them to see that the use of evidence strengthens the advocacy asks. So when they get these budget scorecards and look at the trends, for instance, in the current scorecard, we've seen that overall allocations for EPI commodities have increased, for reproductive health commodities have increased, although the component for family planning commodities is still very small. So they're able to go down to details such as that to see that we just don't look at an overall allocation for our
Charity, we're losing you a little bit. I wonder if maybe, as much as we'd like to see you, I wonder if maybe you want to go off video so we can hear you.
But we know how much actually over the years, we can see the performance. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now
can you hear me?
Thank you, yeah.
Yes, I guess that was the video. Yes, so the trends data that is on the scorecard is very useful because it informs Ministry of Health is able to see their performance. We are able to hold them accountable over the years to see where the increases have been and what they've actually done, and also to inform performance and advocacy for the coming years. Thank you.
That's so interesting. And Charity, to me, it's such a privilege to have a chance to be in conversation with all of you. As we go, if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and ask some clarifying questions. So you mentioned some of the things that this systematic methodology can do in terms of getting the data and showing trends, in terms of where are their investments in reproductive health commodities, what part of that is family planning commodities, what's the trend over time. And you also said that the tools help you identify where there are gaps in data or where data is not available. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? You mentioned that with the latest scorecard, you were able to see that there's actually been an increase from the government in investments in sexual and reproductive health commodities in general. And although the family planning portion of that remains very small. How easy is it for you as advocates to get a hold of the data to look at the investments in SRHR and disaggregate the investments in family planning?
Thank you, Christina. So we're able to access all data on allocations for SRHR commodities. But when it comes to the programs, which would be data on service delivery, demand creation, and all the other aspects, it's very difficult because that data is very aggregated. The service delivery is aggregated across all health programs, so to speak. So what we do is we go into the allocations and see if we can get disbursements data. Disbursements data is also available. The only issue is that it's not in a timely manner. The challenges that we've got over the years is the access to expenditure data. So the journey starts really well at allocations. The data is publicly available, and then it slows down to disbursements. We eventually get the data. But when we begin to ask questions about allocations, how much went where, that's where the challenges are. So when we get the data, we're at allocations level, we're able to disaggregate the one for FB commodities, if at all, and at disbursements as well. If there's an allocation for the commodities, it will be very clear in disbursement. But if we haven't got, when we go to expenditures, normally there's hardly any data there, and we've only managed, until, for the past financial year, we only managed to get some of that data from the Global Financing Facility. But in the past 3 years, the trend was that there was no expenditures data, which led us to ask more and more questions. And we look forward to just really using the scorecard to get answers to these questions.
Thank you so much, Charity. And I think that's such an interesting point and reinforces some of the themes that Jen brought up. This trend of even when there are investments, it tends to be in commodities. One thing you brought up is that you're able to look at investments in commodities, but it's much harder to disaggregate what's actually being invested in service delivery. And if I understood your last point well, as you're identifying these places where there's data gaps or it's hard to see the data, that you're raising questions with the government, which is interesting because it sounds like you're also doing some advocacy for budget transparency or data transparency. So thank you so much for that, Charity. That's very interesting. I wonder if we could go to Wezi. And Wezi, from the conversations we recently had when we were together in Thailand, you know, I was very interested in what you had to share about kind of the journey that Malawi has had in terms of its investments in family planning. And I'd love to maybe hear more about what your organization has seen and how you have used the scorecard and the common framework to analyze trends in investments in Malawi. Wezi, I think you're on mute. There we go. Okay.
Thank you very much, Christina. Where, yes, in Malawi joined the common framework in the year 2017 and has actually been tracking the data since then. Mm-hmm. And when we started in terms of the tracking, what we found that there was no budget allocation that was made to the family planning programs, so that the whole program was actually in the hands of the donor resources. And then we also found that, yes, all of it was in the hands of the donor resources. And then family planning commodities had an allocation, but this allocation increased very minimally. And we actually found that it had actually just plateaued at 83 million. In the year 2017 and 18. And then we then actually moved forward to, we also found that the allocation as a share of the need dropped from 2.6% in 2017 to about 1.5%. So you'd find that instead of increasing, the share was actually decreasing, and which was a concern to us. So what we did was we also discovered was that the other discovery that we had was the budget expenditure was moved from 73% before we started the actual advocacy But when we got together and started using the tool, the scorecard, and brought forward the evidence, we found that it actually moved to 100% in the year 2019-2020. And then we also discovered that in the course of working, that the government expenditure on family planning as a share of the total funding also fluctuated between 1% to 2.2% over a 4-year period. So what we did was to get together a number of civil society who were interested in the family planning. So we worked as a team, and each one brought the information that they had to their table, but we brought the evidence, which was the tracking tool, which we used to engage the government decision makers, parliamentarians, as well as the other stakeholders. Like in this one, the other stakeholders would be like the central medical stores, where there were also problems in terms of the supplies. There were sometimes the allocation would be made, but when for them to actually procure the commodities would take a long time or even not being procured. So those were the findings that we had at the beginning. And maybe thereafter, we also, maybe in our, it's not maybe, in our finding, we also discovered that when we joined the civil society in terms of the coalition, MANASO was new to the family planning program. So because of that, sometimes there was that aspect of maybe trust to say, what are you bringing on the table? But as we began to work with the scorecard and the tracking tool, people were able to see the evidence that they couldn't dispute, because there were data that was available and there were documents that could actually bring them on the table. So we found that both from the civil society coalition, people were able to accept what we're bringing on the table. But again, from the government, we were also able to listen to what was being discussed. So that made it easy in terms of us to actually to work with the data. And again, when we engaged the parliamentarians, it was also a moment where the parliamentarians were able to say, this is the data that we want in our discussion. You know, sometimes we just talk about things, but we don't have the information that is there to back up our decision. Thank you.
That was really interesting. And I'm going to come back to you, Wesley, because I know that you have a really interesting story in how you use this for advocacy. So let's put a pin in that, because I want to come back to that story. But, you know, some of the things that really struck me from what you were sharing, which resonates with some of the themes that Jen talked about. I know in Malawi, as you mentioned, at one point, all of the family planning, was it family planning programs and commodities were covered through donor resources? Is that correct?
No, all the family planning programs.
All the family planning programs. Okay, so the domestic investment in the family planning was just in the commodity side, not the program side.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great. And it sounds like using the systematic methodology, we're really able to surface this data. If I understood you correctly, Wesley, it also sounded like this tool created a way from different civil society organizations that kind of come together and share data to create a common set of data that you use for advocacy. Did I hear you correctly on that one?
Yes. And also maybe in our coming together, you'd find some of them had actually different expertise in the other areas. So especially when we were going to the parliamentarians, each one was able to look at to say, yeah, let's also look at this angle, because these are the findings that we're having related to the family planning, and put our arguments together. So we're able to bring the data, and then the others were able to bring in the other cases in terms of the areas of the investment and bring it on the table. So it enriched the discussion when we're engaging the parliamentarians on the table.
Great, great. And you also mentioned that you were bringing data that really spoke to the interests of policymakers. Yes. Thank you so much, Wesley. I'm going to move to our colleague, Jerome. Jerome, I'm wondering if you could tell me about your experience in Benin. And Jerome, I believe, is going to speak in French, so make sure that everyone has that you've pressed the interpretation button on the bottom so you can listen in your first language. Jerome, I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the experience of GRAFED in using the common framework and scorecard, and what were some of the trends that you were seeing in the last round of scorecard?
OK. Merci, Christina. Et nous avons pris le train en marche. Le Bénin a pris le train en marche. Cette expérience a commencé et n'a pas fait partie de la première phase. Nous disons que c'est une expérience très intéressante pour nous. Les tableaux de bord, le cadre commun nous a permis de voir clair dans les allocations pour la planification familiale en général dans notre pays et particulièrement pour les produits contraceptifs. Et nous avons, sur la base de cet outil, on a pu aboutir à quelques recommandations, lesquelles recommandations nous ont permis d'aborder des thèmes clairs de plaidoyer pour le financement de la planification familiale et particulièrement le financement de l'achat des produits contraceptifs. Alors, quand le Bénin a commencé cette expérience, nous avons été deux structures, il y a Social Watch et l'ONG GRAFED qui s'occupe du volet plaidoyer, et Social Watch s'est occupé du volet suivi budgétaire, mais les deux se réunissent régulièrement pour faire le point global de l'activité. Et alors, nous avons pu, sur la base de l'outil du tableau de bord, nous avons pu faire le suivi de l'année 2019, le suivi du financement de la planification de l'année 2019, tant dans les programmes que dans les produits. Et ce suivi a été aussi fait en 2020. Et quand nous avons abordé l'année 2020, nous avons noté que sur la base des indicateurs, les 10 indicateurs dont on a parlé tout à l'heure, si nous prenons par exemple l'indicateur sur la pertinence, le tableau de bord nous a permis de montrer que les allocations pour la planification familiale sont restées pertinentes pour les années 2019 et 2020, tant au niveau des programmes qu'au niveau des produits. On est parti de 67,4% en 2019 et 40,7% en 2020. C'est toujours resté pertinent, mais on a noté une certaine baisse, parce qu'on est passé de 67% en 2019 par rapport à la pertinence à 40,7%. Et la principale raison de cette baisse est la COVID. Donc, la priorité, la planification familiale a été pertinente. Les dépenses, les allocations dans la planification familiale ont été reconnues pertinentes dans le pays, mais avec une baisse de cette pertinence due à l'apparition de la COVID-19. Il en est de même pour les produits. Ça, c'est par rapport au programme. Pour les produits aussi, on a noté qu'il y a une certaine pertinence dans l'allocation, dans l'achat des produits contraceptifs. Donc, on est parti de 45,3% à 31,3% en 2020, bien sûr. Donc, c'est pour les 2 années. De même, en ce qui concerne la priorité, est-ce que le tableau de bord, l'outil, le cadre commun nous a permis de voir si la planification familiale, les dépenses dans la planification familiale constituent une priorité pour le pays. Et nous avons noté que en 2019, on est à 1,2% et en 2020, la priorité est allée à 1,5% pour les programmes et pour les produits. La transparence a augmenté de 2019 à 2020. Et en 2020, nous avons eu plus de données. Nous avons eu plus de données disponibles en 2020 qu'en 2019. En 2019, quand on a commencé, c'est vrai que le Bénin est dans la sous-région, est le premier pays en matière de transparence budgétaire. Mais quand il faut aller fouiller dans les dépenses, c'est surtout au niveau des dépenses qu'il y a eu des problèmes. Et quand il faut aller fouiller dans les dépenses, au niveau des services, au niveau des ministères, on a constaté que beaucoup de données n'étaient pas disponibles ou bien le personnel des ministères n'était pas tellement ouvert pour fournir les données. Mais après un an, quand on a quitté 2019, en 2020, on a eu plus de données en 2020 qu'en 2019. Donc, le cadre nous a permis quand même d'évoluer en matière de transparence par rapport aux données liées au programme et aux produits. Nous pouvons dire de façon globale que selon les tendances, les allocations des programmes et des produits comme des parts de besoins de financement ont considérablement augmenté de 2018 à 2019, puis ont chuté en 2020. Quand on voit notre courbe de tendance, et la principale raison de cette chute est que en 2020, il y a eu l'épidémie de la COVID-19. Alors, nous avons, à partir de cette donnée, parce qu'on n'a pas parcouru, on n'a pas pu présenter tous les indicateurs, on a juste prélevé quelques indicateurs renseignés que nous sommes en train de présenter. À partir des indicateurs, à partir des données collectées, nous avons tiré quelques avantages que nous avons tirés, bien sûr, des deux tableaux de bord. C'est que le suivi budgétaire en matière de la planification familiale s'est amélioré. Avant, il suffit simplement que les pays déclarent, bon, oui, nous avons alloué tel montant, tel nombre de millions, telle quantité de millions à la planification familiale ou bien à l'achat des produits contraceptifs, et on s'en tient à cela. Il n'y a pas de contrôle. On ne va plus au-delà de ça. On s'arrête simplement à la déclaration, à l'inscription du montant sur les lignes budgétaires. Qu'est-ce que les montants ont servi à faire? Donc, les tableaux de bord nous ont permis d'aller au-delà et de voir comment les dépenses ont été faites et qu'est-ce que ça a pris, combien ont été dans les programmes, combien ont été dans l'achat des produits contraceptifs et quelle est la qualité de ces dépenses et à quel moment ces dépenses ont été effectuées. Parce qu'il ne sert pas d'allouer un montant à la planification familiale et d'attendre la fin de l'année pour sortir une quantité d'argent et tout se dépense dans la précipitation. Là, il n'y a pas eu une efficacité dans les dépenses. Donc, voilà un peu. Maintenant, les tableaux de bord contribuent aussi au renforcement des efforts en matière de plaidoyer budgétaire. Et ça, c'est vrai parce qu'on a de la matière, on a d'éléments probants pour montrer au gouvernement que voilà, sur la base d'un outil que nous avons utilisé, voilà ce qui en est. Et il faut noter que les tableaux de bord facilitent le suivi en temps réel du budget alloué à la planification familiale et permet aux organisations de la société civile de disposer des données factuelles, des données probantes pour étayer, pour rendre vivant le plaidoyer. Et enfin, nous pouvons aussi dire que les tableaux de bord permettent donc aux OSC de disposer des évidences afin de soutenir le plaidoyer budgétaire en faveur de la planification familiale. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much. One of the things that really struck me from what you were saying was the importance of real-time data. And you said something really powerful. It doesn't mean a lot if there is budget allocated for family planning, both commodities and programs, if it isn't spent, and it's spent very quickly at the end of the year. And if I understand you correctly, Jerome, it sounds like this tool let you track those expenditures in real time, not just what was allocated, but what was being spent for programs and for commodities, and bringing that data as advocates to push the government. Am I understanding you correctly?
Oui, il y a eu quelques données en temps réel. Il faut dire que de façon globale, c'est très difficile d'avoir des données en temps réel. Mais avec l'approche que nous avons utilisée, en l'occurrence SOCIAL et GRAFED, qui était d'avoir des contacts directs au sein des gouvernants, au sein du personnel du ministère de la Santé. On a pu glaner quelques données en temps réel, mais il faut dire que de façon globale, c'est très difficile d'avoir des données trimestrielles. Au cours d'un atelier, la dernière fois, quand on préparait notre rencontre, notre plaidoyer à l'endroit des députés, il y a de cela 4 semaines, il a été noté, la direction, les gens qui étaient venus du ministère des Finances nous ont dit qu'au fait, il est difficile d'avoir les données trimestrielles parce que les dépenses budgétaires, la libération des montants alloués respectent une certaine méthodologie, c'est-à-dire qu'il faut attendre que les premiers fonds qui ont été alloués puissent être totalement finis avant qu'on ouvre encore un second financement, si bien que la libération des allocations ne respecte plus la période initialement prévue qui est de libérer les fonds de façon trimestrielle. Mais on attend que les premières dépenses soient finies ou bien qu'on atteigne un grand pourcentage dans les dépenses avant d'ouvrir encore une autre vanne pour d'autres dépenses. Si bien que on n'arrive pas, pour certaines données, on n'arrive pas à les avoir en temps réel. On est un peu confronté à ça. L'autre raison qu'ils ont avancée, c'est que c'est vrai que le budget est annoncé, mais il faut mobiliser les fonds. L'État attend aussi à des moments donnés la mobilisation des ressources avant de les mettre à disposition des programmes et services. Voilà.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I keep hearing this theme of the importance of data to really start a conversation and be welcome at the table to influence policymakers. But you talked about, and we're hearing from other people, the challenges of getting that data in real time. The other thing that I noted here that maybe want to come back to is it sounds like some of this data wasn't just publicly available, but you needed to build trusting relationships with personnel inside the government to get the data. So that's another thing for us to think about, is the importance of those relationships. Thank you so much, Jerome. This is such an interesting conversation. I hope you all are enjoying it as much as I have. We're going to go now to Julien. And again, he is the president of Justice Sociale. I'm wondering if you could tell me about some of the work that you have been doing in Côte d'Ivoire. I know that your organization is a leader in budget advocacy and accountability for SRHR and family planning in Côte d'Ivoire. I'd love to hear some of your experiences in using this common framework and scorecard, and what kind of data you were able to generate, and also how you use that data. Over to you.
Merci beaucoup, Christina. Je salue tout le monde. Alors, je voudrais dire que Social Justice travaille sur les questions de gouvernance de façon générale, de transparence, et une action spécifique sur la question de transparence budgétaire. Et c'est dans ce cadre que nous avons fait notre premier pas sur les questions de santé en essayant d'analyser la question de transparence budgétaire, la question de budget lié à la question de planification familiale. Alors, le cadre commun a été très utile pour nous dans le cadre de ce travail-là. Et ce cadre commun, sa mise en œuvre et son analyse nous a permis de tirer plusieurs conclusions, au nombre desquelles je voudrais vous partager 5. Alors, le premier élément que je voudrais relever ici en termes de conclusion sur la mise en œuvre du cadre commun, c'est que nous avons compris dans la mise en œuvre de cette politique du cadre commun-là que l'allocation des programmes de planification familiale est restée la même sur l'année fiscale 2019 et 2020. Donc, le montant est resté la même chose à 108 millions de francs CFA. Au même moment que l'allocation de planification familiale est restée identique, nous avons constaté aussi que le besoin en financement a diminué de 3,9% à 3,4%. Ça, nous avons essayé de comprendre les raisons. On pourra nous dire qu'il y a eu une avancée. On nous dit également qu'il y a une politique qui est en cours. Est-ce que ça explique cela? Mais nous n'avons pas eu le temps d'approfondir pour comprendre ce qui a justifié cette diminution du besoin alors que l'allocation est restée statique. L'autre conclusion que je voudrais partager, c'est que l'allocation aussi pour les produits de planification familiale est restée la même chose dans l'année fiscale 2019 et 2020. Le montant est resté à 400 millions, alors que l'engagement a été fait d'augmenter de 10% chaque année à atteindre un montant. Et nous avons compris que depuis la prise de cet engagement, c'est pratiquement le montant de 400, voire par moment 500 millions, mais de façon générale, c'est autour de 400 millions l'allocation de produits contraceptifs. C'est resté identique. Alors, nous avons aussi compris que les besoins en financement étaient aussi restés sur les 2 années à 15,5% en termes d'allocation de la part de besoins en financement. L'autre point que nous voulons relever comme conclusion à la suite du travail sur le cadre commun, c'est que le taux de dépenses pour l'allocation au programme de planification familiale est passé de 100% dans l'année fiscale 2017 à 20% en 2018. Les autres années, nous n'avons pas pu avoir accès à ces informations. D'ailleurs, ce sera l'une des difficultés que nous allons relever lorsque nous allons aborder le point sur point au niveau de notre exposé. Alors, avant-dernière conclusion, avant de passer à notre point, c'est que nous n'avons pas constaté de dépenses sur les produits contraceptifs de 2017 à 2019. En 2017, il n'y avait pas eu d'allocation, c'est ce que nous avons compris. En 2017, il n'y avait pas eu d'allocation. Par contre, en 2018 et en 2019, c'est vrai qu'il y a eu des allocations, mais nous n'avons pas eu d'informations sur les décaissements, sur les dépenses. Donc, la situation d'exécution ne nous a pas permis de voir qu'effectivement, il y avait eu des dépenses réalisées. Enfin, les dépenses pour l'allocation au programme de planification familiale, comme une part de besoin en financement, sont passées de 2,3% à 1% en 2017 et 2018. C'est seulement 20% de l'allocation en 2020 plutôt, qui ont été dépensées. En 2020, il y a eu seulement 20% des allocations qui ont été dépensées. En 2019 et 2020, les informations n'ont pas été rendues disponibles. Donc, il y a ce défi. Alors, qu'est-ce que nous tirons comme, je vais dire, élément important dans la mise en œuvre de ce cadre commun? Comment ça nous a aidés? Alors, je voudrais dire que le cadre commun nous a été très utile dans le développement de stratégies de plaidoyer au regard des résultats que nous venons de relever. Vous voyez bien qu'on parle de difficultés d'accès à l'information, du fait que les dépenses ne sont pas désagrégées et que c'est difficile d'avoir ces informations. Et donc, ce travail nous a permis de non seulement nous-mêmes proposer un référentiel d'informations à publier, et nous avons utilisé cela aussi pour mettre en place un comité de suivi qui nous a permis, nous, de comprendre les difficultés réelles. Et c'est justement à partir de cela que nous avons proposé qu'un engagement soit pris par le gouvernement dans le cadre de l'OGP. L'OGP, c'est Open Government Partnership, c'est un engagement qui permet l'ouverture des données, la participation citoyenne, la question de transparence. Et donc, le cadre commun nous a aidés à avoir des informations nécessaires, la situation pour proposer un engagement. Et je vous assure que la qualité des informations a été facile, nous a permis de faire en sorte que l'engagement soit accepté de façon unanime par l'ensemble des membres du comité technique OGP, y compris même au niveau du gouvernement. Et donc, nous avons pu avoir 2 engagements au niveau du plan d'action OGP, qui est un document officiel signé par le gouvernement. C'est la création de la ligne, puisque je vous ai dit tout à l'heure que c'était difficile d'avoir des informations. La création de la ligne budgétaire pour que nous puissions suivre effectivement le décaissement, parce que ce que nous avons compris, c'est qu'il y a une ligne globale et cette ligne comprend les produits contraceptifs, les produits de planification familiale, tout ce qui est formation et autres. Et donc, il fallait créer une ligne spécifique pour faire le suivi des dépenses effectives. Et donc, c'était un engagement qui avait été pris par le gouvernement. Deuxième engagement, puisque c'était difficile d'avoir des informations, c'était de faire en sorte qu'on puisse avoir une plateforme de données au niveau du ministère de la Santé pour qu'on puisse publier les informations. Donc ça, c'était pris aussi comme un engagement. Alors, comme bien fondé, ce qui nous a permis de renforcer notre plaidoyer, nous avons pu avoir une meilleure visibilité, une bonne connaissance des défis en matière de suivi du financement de la planification familiale et des produits contraceptifs. Et cela nous a aidé à orienter nos actions au niveau de la société civile, nos actions de plaidoyer. Et le cadre commun nous a permis de renforcer, je dis, notre collaboration avec des institutions étatiques, notamment la Commission d'accès à l'information publique, la KIDP, qui est une institution qui existe ici, qui permet d'aider les structures qui ont des difficultés pour avoir des informations. Et cette structure nous a permis d'avoir certaines informations que nous avons publiées, mais en même temps, ça a renforcé notre cadre de collaboration. Ils nous ont même appuyé dans l'élaboration de notre référentiel de données. Et puis, ça a permis aussi d'avoir, je vais dire, un partenariat avec l'OGP. Je peux vous dire que tout à l'heure, j'ai eu un échange avec l'OGP et après notre échange, nous allons avoir des discussions sur l'état d'avancement des engagements et on m'a dit que la ligne budgétaire a été créée, ce que je n'ai pas compris, mais en même temps, je prends avec beaucoup de réserve puisque tout à l'heure, nous allons échanger pour que nous puissions avoir effectivement un état effectif des lieux. Alors, comme mon succès de plaidoyer que nous avons obtenu en utilisant le tableau de bord, c'est ce que j'ai dit tout à l'heure, ça nous a permis d'élaborer un référentiel de données qui a été utilisé comme élément de base pour que le gouvernement puisse développer les informations à publier. On nous a aussi dit qu'il y a un document qu'ils ont appelé référentiel technique qui a été élaboré par le ministère de la Santé et ce document a été approuvé et devait servir de base pour publier les informations. Nous n'avons pas encore accès à ces informations et à ces données, je veux dire à ce document, mais nous pensons que nous allons l'avoir dans les jours qui suivent pour que nous puissions faire le suivi des informations qui pourront nous aider aussi à renforcer le cadre commun. Alors, comme succès aussi, c'est l'engagement à créer la ligne budgétaire qui était dans un document officiel et qui nous permet, nous, de faire le suivi. Et puis aussi, le cadre commun a été un élément qui a mobilisé la société civile autour d'une pétition qui non seulement a permis de demander à ce qu'il y ait la création de la ligne, mais aussi a permis de demander à ce que le gouvernement puisse respecter l'engagement d'augmenter l'allocation en ce qui concerne la planification familiale. Donc, les produits de planification familiale. Alors, nous avons rencontré beaucoup de difficultés dans notre travail. C'est que le fait qu'il n'y ait pas de ligne budgétaire spécifique aux produits contraceptifs a été un frein pour que nous puissions suivre les décaissements, pour que nous puissions avoir une meilleure visibilité des efforts en matière de planification familiale et de produits contraceptifs. Nous avons eu aussi quelques difficultés, notamment la réticence du ministère de la Santé et du programme. Et justement, c'est la collaboration que nous avons eue avec l'OGP et la KIDP qui ont mené à ce que ces entités-là puissent nous fournir des informations. Ça a été difficile, certes, mais je pense qu'avec ce travail que nous avons fait de plaidoyer, les choses sont en train progressivement de s'améliorer et un engagement est en train d'être pris par le ministère de la Santé pour pouvoir publier certaines informations. Mais nous relevons dans tous les cas qu'il y a une réticence de ces acteurs au niveau du ministère de la Santé. Il y a aussi un manque d'informations concernant les décaissements et les dépenses périodiques sur le programme de planification familiale, mais aussi sur l'achat de produits contraceptifs. Et puis, nous avons appris qu'il y aura un programme de gratuité qui est vu comme un frein à la création de la ligne budgétaire parce que pour eux, c'est gratuit. Et donc, nous avons relevé le fait que la gratuité n'exclut pas le fait qu'il y ait la ligne budgétaire parce que ça permet de voir les efforts. Enfin, pour terminer, nous avons tiré des leçons dans le cadre de notre travail. C'était assez difficile, c'était un secteur nouveau, c'était pour la question de transparence, d'accessibilité, c'était un défi, mais nous avons compris que la collaboration avec des entités étatiques en charge de l'accès à l'information, mais en charge de bonne gouvernance, est un élément important qui peut soutenir le travail de la société civile, notamment dans notre cadre, et qui a permis de sensibiliser les acteurs du ministère de la Santé afin que nous puissions avoir accès à certaines informations, mais aussi que le ministère de la Santé et les institutions en charge de la planification familiale puissent aussi élaborer des référentiels de données qui vont permettre de faire un suivi, mais aussi de prendre en charge l'engagement concernant le financement des produits contraceptifs et l'accès aux informations. L'autre élément, c'est que nous avons pu avoir une collaboration avec les fêtières de la société civile. Et ça nous a été utile pour pouvoir, je vais dire, amorcer notre action de plaidoyer, notamment vers le gouvernement, le ministère de la Santé et ses institutions. Mais nous sommes aussi en train de développer un autre accès, un autre élément sur la décentralisation. Nous sommes en collaboration aujourd'hui avec les entités décentralisées, notamment les fêtières des communes et des régions, de sorte à ce que nous puissions déjà amorcer le processus de transparence, puisque nous avons compris que certaines communes ont des budgets pour financer les produits contraceptifs et la planification familiale. Et donc, la collaboration avec ces entités, nous avons projeté la création d'une ligne dans le budget de ces collectivités. Donc, c'est la collaboration qui est en train de permettre à ce que nous puissions mettre en place un niveau de transparence au niveau aussi décentralisé et qui peut être utile au niveau centralisé. Donc, voici résumé notre modeste contribution et expérience en la matière. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Julianne. I mean, something that I think is very interesting, that's a theme coming across all of these presentations is, one, we need to know whether or not there has been investments made in the commodities and the programs, whether those monies have been dispersed. But you're bringing up the point that it's very hard to track that if there wasn't one budget line item that you could track. So it sounds like you were able to use the common framework to mobilize civil society to ask for one budget line item for family planning commodities, I think. And it sounds like you also use this as an opportunity to advocate for a commitment from the government, more and better data transparency, and that's even happening at the local level. So I think that's very interesting that it's important to basically make sure that there's a way to have visibility on the data in on family planning. But broadly, you talked about the importance, and if I understand you correctly, you were able to get a commitment from the government on making health data more available to citizens to drive advocacy. So those are really two very important advocacy goals. Thank you so much, Julianne. I know that there are some questions for folks who want to learn about using the toolkit. I'm wondering if I could go around and ask a few more questions of the panelists, and then we can go to some of the questions in the chat. We started talking about this, but I think this is where we want to end up, is hearing much more about how you use this data for advocacy and what successes you had, even what challenges you faced. And maybe I'll go back to Wezi. I'm wondering if you could tell us about how you use this data for advocacy, especially some of the very interesting successes you had during the time of COVID. I'd like to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We've used the scorecard and the data that we have for our advocacy in our coalition with the decision makers, that's Ministry of Health, Ministry of Finance, and the Reproductive Health Department. We've also used the same information with the parliamentarians. The results of that was that we discovered that our budget in 2019 to 2020 had actually increased by 125%. You recall earlier on I was saying that we had actually seen that the budget had actually plateaued or was increasing with very minimal size at 83 million Malawi kwacha. And then we also found that through the advocacy that we had carried out using the scorecard and the tool, the budget was fully spent. Because previous in the other years, no one was was tracking and informing the government that the allocations that were being given, they weren't being fully spent. Some they were going back to the government. And in some cases, maybe the disbursements were also coming at the end of the year, such that the surprise when they were coming, it was well into the other years. And then we also, in 2020 and 2021, we also discovered that during that time, there was COVID. And because of COVID, there was pressure in terms of the government resources. So a decision was made to reduce the budget from the allocation that it had by 10 million Malawi kwacha. And when we got the information, we mobilized ourselves as civil society organizations and got together and developed our advocacy messages that we wanted to take to the government. We discussed with the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Finance, but we didn't see, they didn't seem to have solutions to our asks, what we were asking for. So what we did was now to mobilize ourselves and meet the parliamentarians. So we had a meeting with the Parliamentary Committee on Health, but we had also invited the chairperson and the vice chairperson of the Budget and Finance Committee. We also invited the chairperson and vice chairperson of the Women Caucus, and they were in that forum. And I think we had also invited the chairperson and the vice from the HIV/AIDS to be also part of the team. So in that area, we actually presented our case and we had a discussion. It was a very good discussion. But then when we moved, we saw that we also had another plan to say, supposing they don't move, what do we do? So we actually came up with a press release, messages. We agreed amongst ourselves to say, okay, we are going to make sure if we see that from the budget presentation, nothing has moved towards the increase, we're releasing these press releases So we said from the time when they presented the budget, the allocation was still at the level of the decrease that they were. So we actually put in the press release in the media, print media, for 5 consecutive days from the time that the budget was presented in Parliament. So we actually kind of shared the resources. So let's say MANASO would bring in the first one. The next, the civil society organization would actually press the one on the following day until the 5 days. So then we found that by the end of the week, we got wind, no, please stop. We have increased the budget. So the budget, instead of being reduced by 10 million, it was actually increased from the 2019-2020 allocation to in the 2020 to 2021 allocation by 9%. So we looked at that to say that was a big achievement for us as a civil society in terms of our advocacy. But maybe in terms of the challenges that we've actually faced, which some of them have also been highlighted, where the data availability, most of the data that we use for the tracking is not available online. So which means you have to establish relationships with the ministries, go to the officials and get the data that is there. And sometimes because the data is not available online and you have to establish relationships, we've also discovered that there's poor retention of government officials in the areas, especially when there's a change of government or for some reason they change the officer. So it means you establish a relationship where you're able to get the information, they trust you. But when there's a new person, you have to establish that relationship again. And sometimes it takes a while, which makes the data collection maybe delay. You don't get it at the time that you wanted to get it. And then we also maybe discovered in our areas that there were still also some very useful lessons that we got out of it. One of the areas that the lessons we got was the availability of data provided a very powerful tool for driving the advocacy agenda. So if once you had the data, you'd go to the policymakers and everyone, no one would dispute what you have to ask. They would actually listen. And even they start offering solutions. Okay, how about maybe we move this way and that way, because you've got the evidence that's available. And then we also discovered that some of the lessons learned were that transparency of what the information will be used for is also key. Sometimes when we're going into our offices, people say, some would actually be suspicious. Why do you want that data? What are you going to use it for? But as maybe you gather the information, you're also able to engage them before you take it out there. They're able to appreciate what is coming out, and they're also part and parcel of the program. And in the process, maybe when there are also issues on their part, let's say within the reproductive health department, they're also able to flag out the issues to you because they know that you're not working against them, but you're supporting them to drive out the agenda that is in terms of the increasing of the resources, which is for the communities out there. And then we also discovered that working with in the coalition, it provided a strong, united voice where you're able to come out and get more wins. Whereas if you go out alone, you'd find maybe people say, yeah, okay, we've listened to you. But when they see that there's several of you and there's several voices, they know it says, yeah, they have to act and do something. So those were basically the lessons that we learned in terms of
Wezi, when you tell this story, we've talked about the common framework and a set of tools, but what you're really talking about is the political savvy of very, very experienced advocates, right? You talked about the importance of coming together as a community with a shared message and shared ask. You were talking about, bringing your ask to technical people in the ministries of health who actually don't have any political power. So pivoting and engaging with with parliamentarians. And then when you realize parliamentarians will act when there's social pressure on them, so then engaging with the media, right? So that's really interesting, like thinking about it coming from all those angles and thinking about who really has power and what's going to move them. And I also just think this point you made about the importance of building trusting relationships with folks who are going to be able to give that data to you, and that it's not a one and done. People change in the ministry and you have to keep investing in those relationships and even find your allies or champions. So there's an expression, there's the science and the art, and this is a lot of the art of doing advocacy, not just the science. So I really appreciate those stories, Wezi. Thank you so much. And I think that's such an incredible story, you know, facing a decrease in investment in family planning. Not only did you sustain the budget, but you increased it, which I think is an incredible win, especially during the time of COVID. I'm wondering if maybe we could go to Jerome. Jerome, you also had mentioned the importance of, you know, building and sustaining trusting relationships with people who have access to data, who also you can influence. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the advocacy successes you've had and challenges in your context in Benin.
OK, merci. Je crois que avec l'utilisation des tableaux de bord, nous avons quand même noté des succès, quelques succès significatifs. Le premier, c'est que il faut noter que la planification familiale est reléguée au rang de priorité de l'État. L'État même, en marge, quand on prenait des engagements de FP 2030 et de partenariat de Ouagadougou, l'État même a pris un 4e engagement. Ça veut dire que la priorité a augmenté en matière de planification familiale au niveau de l'État. Cet engagement a trait à la gratuité des services de la planification familiale à l'endroit des populations au Bénin. Donc, c'est l'État même qui a pris cet engagement. Le second succès dont on peut parler, c'est l'amélioration des allocations et du décaissement, surtout pour les produits de planification familiale en 2022. C'est-à-dire que nous avons noté que cette année, l'État, on a interpellé le service qui s'occupe de la planification familiale au niveau de la direction de la santé de la mère et de l'enfant. Et il est clair aujourd'hui, il reste à ce que le prochain cadre commun vérifie que l'État béninois a dépassé les prévisions budgétaires pour l'achat des produits contraceptifs. On nous a déjà notifié qu'on est au-delà de 300 millions, alors que l'engagement de partenariat de Ouagadougou a prévu 275 millions pour 2022, c'est-à-dire une augmentation de 10%. Donc, on est déjà au-delà de 300 millions. Ça veut dire qu'il y a une augmentation de l'allocation pour l'achat des produits contraceptifs. L'autre chose que dont je veux parler, ce sont les données collectées. Ces données ont permis aux OSC de faire leur plaidoyer. Maintenant, je voudrais aborder quelque chose de plus important, c'est-à-dire que la pratique du plaidoyer. Au Bénin, il y a l'État, nous avons institué quelque chose lors des sessions budgétaires, lors du vote du budget, la société civile est amenée, est appelée à l'Assemblée nationale. Donc, l'Assemblée nationale accorde une place à la société civile pour qu'elle vienne faire un plaidoyer dans plusieurs domaines. Et parmi ces domaines, il y a eu la planification familiale. Et cette année, c'était le 10 novembre passé que nous avons été à l'Assemblée et nous avons plaidé pour l'augmentation du budget alloué à l'achat des produits contraceptifs. Après le passage de la société civile, le ministère de la Santé est allé à l'Assemblée et les députés ont interpellé. Et ça a été dit clairement par le ministre de la Santé dans son compte rendu à la télévision nationale qu'il y a eu 3 points soulignés par les députés. Au nombre de ces 3 points, il y a que le ministère a été interpellé pour qu'une part significative soit accordée à l'achat des produits contraceptifs. Donc, ce sont les députés qui ont interpellé le ministre de la Santé pour qu'il accorde cette part importante à l'achat des produits contraceptifs. L'autre élément, c'est que non seulement il y a que cette année, lors de notre session, quand les OSC se sont réunis pour préparer le plaidoyer à l'Assemblée nationale, nous avons invité le ministère de la Santé. Et cette fois, quand ils sont venus avec une note de réponse par rapport à notre plaidoyer de l'année dernière. Donc, ils ont répondu point par point par rapport au plaidoyer, aux différents plaidoyers, dont le plaidoyer budgétaire pour l'achat des produits contraceptifs cette année. Donc, le ministère des Finances a répondu, nous a même montré le niveau atteint dans l'allocation du budget à l'achat des produits contraceptifs. Donc, le cadre commun nous a permis de leur montrer la réalité des choses parce que l'année dernière, on leur a fait le point de 2019, de 2020. Voilà, vous avez dit, quand nous, on est allé vérifier sur la base de l'outil important qu'est le cadre commun, voilà ce que nous avons retrouvé. Donc, ça a réveillé leur attention. Cette année, ils sont venus avec une note et ils ont partagé cette note à toutes les organisations. On était une 50aine d'organisations de la société civile dans la salle. Donc, ils ont partagé cette note qui est une réponse à notre plaidoyer de l'année dernière. Donc, ça va continuer. Donc, à toutes les sessions budgétaires, nous serons appelés désormais à faire un plaidoyer à l'Assemblée nationale et le ministère a le devoir désormais de nous produire les réponses de notre plaidoyer de l'année précédente. Donc, c'est l'utilisation que nous avons faite des recommandations issues des cadres communs, de notre tableau de bord, qui a fait que nous avons atteint ces résultats aujourd'hui. Voilà les quelques préoccupations que je voudrais porter à votre attention. Merci.
That's so interesting, Jerome. And I know we're having a little trouble with the translation, but I want to summarize some of the exciting things I heard in case folks missed it. One thing that Jerome was saying is that collectively, the civil society used data collected through the common framework and made a presentation. Jerome, if I understand correctly, was it a presentation to the Ministry of Health or Ministry of Finance about the state of affairs in 2020? And then it was such a powerful presentation that actually the next year, the Ministry of Health, ahead of engaging with you, prepared a summary of their investments that they were making in family planning, which I think is very interesting. Another thing I think that's very interesting, Jerome, is often we engage with the ministries of health, but we don't engage with the ministries of finance. And in the end, that's who we really need to engage with if we want to shape decisions about budget. I'm wondering if you could just, I just want to say that's a very interesting approach. I'm so sorry to those who are not able to hear in the English translation. I hope that I captured some of your main points, Jerome. I'm keeping an eye on the time. We actually only have 7 minutes left. I wanted to, I think we could speak for a long time because these are such interesting stories. Maybe hear briefly from Charity and then also end with some comments from Amos going forward on how he sees that we might use these tools. I wonder, Charity, did you have anything to add about some of the advocacy wins, successes, or challenges you have faced in Uganda?
Thanks. I'm not going to turn my camera on because it will.
Okay, we're having a lot of tech problems this morning. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
I apologize, but right now we can all hear the French translation. If you could ask the French translator to use that channel. Please go ahead, Charity.
Yeah, sure. So one of I'm going to just list one success due
Okay,
to the
great,
time.
great.
Yes,
Oh, I think we've lost Charity. Technology is not on our side this morning, I'm telling you.
can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. Go ahead, Charity.
Yeah.
I'm sorry we've lost you. Okay. So listen, I'm keeping an eye on the time. I hope Charity will join us again. I know that we did have some questions in the chat. I also wanted to make sure that we had a moment to ask a question of Amos. I'm wondering if there's any questions in the chat here that we would like to share. Several people have asked where we can get the toolkit. That's definitely going to be made available afterwards. And also kind of a summary of some of the advocacy wins and successes that we've heard. While we're waiting for Charity, I might hand it over to Amos. Amos, your organization, CRHE, had a powerful role after the development of the common framework to refine it and evolve it over the past 3 years. You're a leader in advocacy in Zambia, but also you are acting as a civil society rep on ensuring that the global financing facility is making the right kinds of investments at the global level. So in all of those roles, I want to ask you if you have any reflections from today's conversation, and also some of the closing remarks you might have about some of the ways that we could use these kind of tools for advocacy. Hand it over to you.
Thanks, Christina, and good to see you. Colleagues, good afternoon and good morning. Thank you so much. I mean, I don't have much time. Let me first and foremost thank you, PAI, for supporting us to ensure that this common framework actually is able to work. I'm sure, Christina, you've heard from my colleagues whom we have worked together in terms of how we were able to use the common framework for decision-making purposes. So for Zambia, what we highly did with the scorecard and the common framework is that we were able to use it for decision-making. So for instance, when we are using it in terms of transparency, we are able to work with the donors, we are able to work with the ministries, both Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Health, to ensure that the disbursements of funds are actually accelerated or are also improved. One of the things that I must mention is that since the time we began using the common framework, we've seen that we have improved in the disbursement from the actual number of 3 in a year. We are now actually at 12, which is every month there's a disbursement. Apart from that, this tool enables us to ensure that we are able to engage. It helps us engage with the different technical staff. We don't highly use it with everyone else because people don't understand it. So we use it with people who understand what you are talking about. So the scorecard and the common framework has been restricted to people who sit in the technical working groups, the people who are actually making decisions at both Ministry of Health and Ministry of Finance, so that they're able to see what the pace at which we are moving. So for instance, disbursement, procurement of commodities, the allocation against the expenditure. So that's what we've been able to do with this particular tool. Now, when it comes to what we need to do with it, I think for me, we need to strengthen it because we have already seen the impact in which other countries are using. And then I also want to urge my colleagues, those who are not using it with the Ministry of Finance, that it's a good tool to share with them just how it works. And then also it helps them make informed choice because sometimes they don't know. And then secondly, I would suggest that we try by all means to use it to also lobby and advocate for resource mobilization because that too actually shows. However, the challenge is sometimes we are not able to access data in good time for us to actually utilize this tool for real time. I mean, sometimes data is difficult for a number of reasons. I think colleagues have given reasons in their different countries in terms of why they are not able to access data. And last but not least, I think the tool also helps us to develop evidence-based advocacy messages, because that's where you actually get the actual message that you're able to use when developing your message. So let's ensure that this tool is strengthened, and then also it's be able to be published widely so that people are able to learn lessons from it and use it. We can improve it more. I think that's something that we've been trying to do with the team, but it's a very good tool that we should use. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Could I pick up on your last point? And I'd like to share a great question from the participants. You know, we've talked a lot about budget transparency, about whether or not we can track expenditures. I haven't heard a lot about equity. And I wonder if that might be, I wonder if you could say more about that. And the question from our colleague was, has a scorecard been able to shed light on FP budgeting for special needs, such as for women with disabilities? For example, has the Ministry of Health managed to provide FP services for deaf and blind people? What was their findings around these issues, or an indicator for data related to FP inclusive health and rights? I think it's a really interesting question, because you've talked about whether or not there's commodities, whether or not the programs are funded. Does this framework track at all sort of equity and inclusion?
So for the reason being that this is something that we are trying, it had a lot of gaps that we had to improve on. However, I must mention that the challenge with tracking equity is that we need to start from the budget itself. So the budget does not segment in terms of how much they are budgeting for even vulnerability. They budget for RH, or they budget for family planning, or they budget for RAMCAN. When you look at even the indicators that these countries are using, so for instance, Zambia is using an output-based budget right now. The output-based budget, the resource can be moved within a particular container, and you cannot say much. So it becomes very, very difficult to even aggregate in terms of equity. So what we need to do as advocates is, first and foremost, we need to identify what indicators are we going to use if we want to track equity. Are we going to categorize the disability itself? How are we going to do it? And then we also need to work closely with the people with disability in terms of them helping. What is it that they want to see that should be tracked? But as far as the budget is concerned, already, Christina, we're having challenges with the Ministry of Finance, even getting this resource. So now, personally, I feel we'll be asking too much to include equity in the tracking indicators, because we need to then track each and every category. So for instance, we need to track how much resource is going towards usage of men involvement, because that's equity. We need to track what actual program are men doing in terms of promotion of male involvement. We need to track what resource is going towards the disability and what is it being used for. So that becomes a challenge. But if we're able to aggregate certain indicators, that's something that we can do. But however, for advocacy purposes, we can categorize each and every scorecard or budget based on the country that they want to use. So for instance, commodities are for all. Everyone has those commodities. So you can't say these commodities have been earmarked for people with disability unless you have data that shows you in the country how many of those people with disabilities need specific commodities, and then you are able to actually use them. But for now, I think what is key and what is critical is to ensure that the commodities are reaching the last mile. And even the last mile is part of equity. We are not able to track the actual commodities that are reaching the last mile. So that becomes a little bit difficult, because we are using the scorecard at high level for the purposes of resource mobilization, resource tracking, and then also budget transparency. That's my take.
Yeah. So listen, we're at time. We've hardly had time for any questions, but I want to respect everyone's time and just thank you for a really, really interesting discussion, including that last point, which I think was a great comment to let us know, you know, what what are maybe some other aspects of quality, equity, and inclusion that we could be tracking or doing other advocacy to complement this budget advocacy? I'm going to maybe hand it back to Katie or Jen to let us know where we might be able to get these resources and tools. There's been several questions here to ask if this is publicly available. Absolutely. This was originated in Samasha Medical Association, which is represented here by our colleague Charity, and in partnership with CRHE, where Moses Works has been evolved into a publicly available tool. So I'm sure that both of them are available. All of our panelists are experts on this methodology, and we'll be sure to share information about where to get it. I'll hand it over to you, Jen or Katie, if you want to offer any closing remarks.
Hi, yeah, thank you, everyone. This has been a great conversation, and I just wanted to follow up on some questions about where people can access the methodology and learn more about it. We have created a web page on the PAI website, which is the FP Budget Scorecard resource page, and there is a link here. We will also be posting this presentation on the website for your reference, and everything will be provided in both English and French. So on this resource page, you'll find the 7 family planning budget scorecards for the 7 countries. The webinar recording in both English and French will be there, and this presentation. And coming soon on this website, we will have a regional infographic about FP budget advocacy and tracking for the 3 Francophone West African countries. We will also have a blog recap of this webinar coming up, and an analysis with more detailed scorecard findings for the countries. You can also find the common framework methodology on our website here in both French and English, as well as more information about the Government Accountability for Family Planning Budgets project. So you can copy this link to find more information, and we will be posting more resources, including a post-webinar blog later this week. I think that's all for now. I'd like to thank everyone for their participation. I'd like to thank our partners and speakers, Jérôme Chatika from GRAFED, Julien Tingan from Social Justice, Wezi Mjojo from MANASO, Charity Nagemi from Samasha, and Amos Male from CRHE. Thank you so much for all of your hard work with FP budget tracking and advocacy. Because of that, you've had some great successes in increasing FP budgets in your countries, and I'm sure you will continue to do so. So with that, I'd just like to thank all of you again, and look forward to providing more resources and information for you on our website. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.